All right, so here we are at Al Kab tombs, which is a set of tombs for people who aren't pharaohs, just nobles and important people. And they are one of only two major tomb locations on the east bank of the Nile rather than the west. The other one, of course, being that of Akhenaten. Now, I want to come into this one because I really want to talk about this one. This is not actually a tomb, this is a symbolic tomb. And it has a number of really interesting things in it. Now, first off, we're just going to go over to see who it is that we're talking about, and that's this guy here. Um, this is the grandson who is the mayor of the town, Al Kab, and this was his grandfather. Now, one of the things we know about the grandfather, the reason why the grandfather was so important, why he wanted to make a symbolic tomb just for him in the memory of him, was, as it says here, in which I can't read personally, he was the admiral of the Egyptian fleet during the Hyksos invasions. He was um, the the admiral, the captain of the fleet when they liberated themselves from the Hyksos. And this here, if I can find it, right here, is the name of the boat that he had. And in fact, when they finished off and defeated the Hyksos, the commander of the Hyksos forces was brought over and hung from the mast of this particular person's boat. One of the things that we notice as well is that up here we have our very first hieroglyph of a chariot, which is something that the Hyksos brought and used much more effectively than the Egyptians did, the first war chariots. And this whole wall is a recounting of the liberation, the War of Liberation against the Hyksos, and it's full of incredible information. Once they learned how to translate all of this, they realized they had a treasure trove of information on how it all went. Now, that being said, there's obviously the Egyptian disclaimer that it is partially propaganda. Not all of it might be true, but it's an incredible piece of work. The other thing I want to point out is that this is not a finished tomb. This is unfinished. We had the mayor died before it was able to be done, so the funds stopped coming, which means people stopped working, which is wonderful because what it also allowed from our unfinished pieces, take a look at how these tombs were created. Now, the hills on the east side of the Nile are sandstone as opposed to the limestone and the alabaster from the west. And so it's a much easier to carve into. So what we can see up here is the first thing that they would do is they would smooth out the rock and get it all ready and plaster it over and make a nice little face. And then they would put in these lines. I'm just going to see if I can come closer, show you some lines. And these registers, these lines, these squares would do two things. First, it would make sure that all of the writing was uniform and in the right spaces and very neatly aligned. But also it told them how much space they had because there were set formulas about how many squares each thing would need. So for example, a single human figure like the one we see here would take 117 squares. An animal, which is somewhat smaller, would take 64 squares. A kneeling person might take 80 squares. And so they could plot it all out before they started. What they would do is then they would draw it in. And sometimes if you take a look, you'll see just a couple of sort of lines. Let's see if we can find one easily seen. I can't find one off the top. And they would have the supervisor come around and check it out to make sure that it was the right thing and the right process. And then once he gave the okay, they started actually scraping in and carving. And you'll notice, if we can take a look, that these are in a little bit of relief. They started the whole carving process. And then once they got fired, the whole carving stopped. But what it would end up looking like is something like this, and then adding all the color and all the paint. So, just a really interesting tomb, a really interesting part, and a little bit of graffiti. Because, what's life without a little bit of graffiti? Mount Charles, perhaps, 1844. Mountie was here. Congratulations. But, anyways, this is just a really cool tomb with some really neat stories to it that I wanted to share with you.